My guest today is the museum director of Eidsvoll Verk, and today we're going to talk about Norwegian history, which is perhaps one of the most important of modern Norwegian history, because this is the story of how we got our constitution. And of course, as always, I ask, how did you get into the history of how Norway got our constitution?
Well, it's a twofold way for me. As a professional, I've been a historian since the early 90s, and as a student, I was involved in that part of history since the beginning of my studies. So at least my thesis at the so-called hovedfag, which is now the master's thesis, was also involved with some of the founding fathers of the Norwegian Constitution, Peder Anker, one of the elder representatives at Eidsvoll Verk, and his some of his conflicts with other representatives of the Christiania elite, the town's elite of the what is called Oslo today, and other social groups. So that was the start of it. And also my two books. I've written a biography on Peder Anker in 2009, which of course says a lot about 1814 and all the processes building up to 1814, and also the book called Spillet om Norge, the Game of Norway, and it's nothing to do with the Game of Thrones, but it has some resemblance in the title, but it's more about the political year of 1814, all the political processes which were totally new for Norway. So I use the American notion of an political revolution in my book, looking for all the different processes from all the treaties that from as outer forces changed history, from the Kiel Treaty of the 14th of January, all the way through the elections and the Constitutional Convention and the war and the peace negotiations, the international representatives in Norway, and also the different negotiations between Sweden and the new founding constitution in Oslo in the autumn, and also of course at the end the union. So you have at least 3 different kings. You have 7 different governments in Norway in 1 year. So it's much is happening.
Yeah.
in a short amount of space and time. So.
Now, you worked there and you worked at Eidsvoll Verk, so the building is called, and you of course been in the room where it happened. You see what I did there, and what is it like to be? Yes, what is it like to be in the room where it happened? Do you kind of feel the ghosts of the politicians who reigned and the founding fathers of Norway, so to speak? Do you feel their presence when you? Probably a silly question, but do you feel a presence when you are in that room?
Well, yes, we feel that it's kind of a rather big obligation for us to say something about the history and all the. Well, many visitors quite rightly have their own notions of this room, that this is the beginning of modern Norway, and this is the cradle of Norwegian democracy. You can use many phrases, but actually very many of our visitors really mean that when they enter, and you can see on their faces that they some kind of awe when they enter the room. And we of course take into considerations that, of course, and even though we don't agree with every visitor, of course, of what they put into the history of 1814, we it is in our task as a museum to deliver the history of 1814 to everyone. So we do that task with very broadly, at least.
Yeah. And so let's begin, because it kind of opens with the Napoleonic Wars, because of course it's always the French. Even in Scandinavian history, the French play a massive part of what made the foundation. So what role did the Napoleonic Wars have with the foundation of Norway?
Yeah, indeed, it's what happens in 1814 is part of the Napoleonic Wars, you might say. We have to start in 1807 at least. Well, we have to start before that as well, but before 1807 you might say that Denmark-Norway ruled as an autocratic state with a sovereign in Copenhagen, Crown Prince Frederick was the sovereign from 1784, crowned as king after his father died in 1808. But that was a very, you might say, one of the most consistently outlined autocracies in the world at the time, because, and for that part in Norway, because we didn't have any nobility or anything. So, well, we had some aristocracy, and we had 2 counties in the Westfold county, but
they were Danish representatives, right?
Yeah, very much Danish representatives, but you could say that it's more or less developing into a Danish Norwegian elite at least during the 18th century. But and as an autocracy, it's a liberal autocracy. It's not like Russia or even France in its you might say potentiality for putting down separatism or any kind of oppositional talks. It is a public sphere in Copenhagen, and also the smaller towns in Norway, at least in the centers of Trondheim, in Bergen, in Kristiansand, and of course Christiania. There are
Christiania, of course, Oslo, which is
contemporary Oslo, yes. So you have the clubs, you have a public sphere, you have you have all the kind of organizations. You have the Freemasonry, you have ballroom societies, you have reading societies, you have also academic societies, and of course the academic society in Trondheim is very influential as well.
But they don't have a university yet, because as I understand, that was one of the things they were striving for, to have a university.
Indeed,
in Norway, because you had to go to Copenhagen to be educated at the time.
Yeah, and there were several complaints about that, because the Norwegians said that, oh, look to Ireland, they have the Trinity College in Dublin. Why don't we? We aren't as well. They looked upon
we aren't Irish.
Yeah, well, they said that, but so yeah, that was one of the complaints, and it was putting forward with different strength through the decades in the last part of the 18th century. But in the 1780s, at least, there was several putting forward the claim for a Norwegian university. But still, within that atmosphere, you might say, it was still a autocracy. The king was on top, and he was potentially a man who could put down everything. It wouldn't be wise, of course, because you could all the Danish representatives sent to Norway had to more or less mediate with the local elites to find out what kind of, should they be a cane from the government, or should they go native as Norwegians. That was it wasn't a very repressive autocracy. But then in 1807, and within this economically, we stayed neutral in many of the wars during the 18th century. And this neutrality situation made at least the merchant elites around the coastlines of Norway rather rich. And when the year 1807 comes, this comes to an end, and which is also changing the atmosphere, the political atmosphere in Norway as well, because in September 1807, the British bomb Copenhagen, and as a result of that, he's still crown prince. His last year as crown prince, Frederick, the sovereign of Denmark, he says that, okay, then I go to the Brits' enemy, and that is of course Napoleon. So we've become an ally with Napoleon, and which is there is a rational thought, you might say, from the Danish government, but it's a very devastating choice for Norway because of all the external export to Britain that is put to an end. And that makes first it's rather patriotic atmosphere in Norway on the case against the Brits and against all enemies of Denmark and Napoleon. But when we go into 1808 and 1809, also after a war between Sweden and Denmark, Norway, then that patriotic wave is flattening out. It's more getting more and more irritated that Copenhagen aren't doing enough, isn't doing enough for Norwegian interests. So that is the start for this. And then you also have the university project coming up again, and you get a university in 1811 then in Oslo.
And we do have to mention, of course, that there is also a great famine in 1808 because,
Indeed,
sorry,
yeah.
1807 because British blockade doesn't really help the grain supply from Denmark, which we were very much dependent on at the time.
Indeed, we were from Jutland. That was the grain chamber of Norway. They called Jutland, Jylland. So that's true. And even national poet, famous Henrik Ibsen, even wrote poems about this. The Terje Vigen poem about how a southern Norwegian fisherman goes by boat to Jutland to get grain to his starving family. So that's part of Norwegian memory, also long into the 19th and even 20th century. But that's also it's turmoil. It's a kind of destabilization of Norwegian society at the same time because of the lack of income, and then you also have a new kind of leaders in Norway. You have Christian August, who is the High Command of Norway, a German-speaking Danish prince, who eventually makes a bold career move by becoming the Crown Prince of Sweden, and also head of the Swedish government during the year 1809. And one of his proteges and one of his, you might say,
is he looked at sorry, is that he looked at kind of a traitor, or is he how is it?
Well, yes, in some chambers, in some circles in Copenhagen, yes, but not in Norway. Norway, he is at last or at least the last commander who has fought back an invading enemy in Norway. So he was very much thought of as a high commander in Norway, all over Norway actually. But of course, those who were mostly connected to Copenhagen were of course very irritated and scared by this, that the high commander of Norway should become the leading man of Sweden. Now that didn't happen for long, because he already in May 1810 he died on a field practice in Skåne in southern Sweden. So he went rather fast out of Swedish history as well. But among that group of kingmakers, you might say, or web spiders in the web around him, was one of the leading men in 1814 as well, and that was Count Wedel Jarlsberg, who became what we call the Union Party leader. That is of course a historical construction afterward, but he was among those who want a settlement with Sweden all the way, all the period, and was very in opposition to many of the ministers in Copenhagen. So those years between 1807 and 1814 is that's years of turmoil, destabilization, famine even, but also of Norwegian self-government. Christian August, he becomes also a leader of a provisional government, den kongelige interimistiske regjeringskommisjon for Norge, as it's called in Norwegian, which was also totally new at the time. And also you got a new institutions like university, but also the Patriotic Society of Norway, so the Kongelige Selskap for Norges Vel, which also becomes a point of gathering for many of the Norwegian elite to talk more about how to develop Norway as a sole nation, you might say. So you got the institutions building up in this period as well. So it's not like in 1814 snap. It's something new. It has, of course, a history.
Of course, I have to mention that Sweden, and this might be hard to believe since we are Scandinavia, the Scandinavian countries are the best of friends today, but back then we were bitter enemies. So Sweden, of course, joined the opposite side, and they want a prize for joining the opposite side of Napoleon.
Yeah.
What is that price that
Sweden well, that's Norway, of course. It's because, as you mentioned, the history between Norway and Denmark, Norway, and Sweden is, of course, as nemesis in war during all the.
And this goes all the way back to the Kalmar Union, where Sweden was kind of second fiddle in.
Yeah. But this and the gruesome century, or the 17th century, the war century, that the wars between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were many and costly. But after the Great Northern War around 1720, that's ended. but just going forward with the history between 1807 and 14, in 1810 you have a new individual, the new mover of Nordic history, you might say, and that's the old Field Marshal of Napoleon, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and who were elected as crown prince and also as head of government in Sweden.
I kind of want to talk about his backstory before he comes, because he's just kind of a normal soldier. He's not part of the French nobility. He just rise in the rank and he takes advantage after the French Revolution, doesn't he?
He came from modest environments. Actually, his father, I think, was a lawyer of a local judge in Pau in southern France. He was of no significance regionally or nationally, but he rose in the ranks of the absolutist French royal armies first. But as being of humble birth, he couldn't rank the top officer posts. So he felt like a glass ceiling there somewhere. So, but then the revolution came, and he could step up with the ranks there. So he became a general rather young in the revolutionary forces, and was rather early in the top ranks, and got major positions as even Minister of War in France, and he was stadtholder in Hanover. He was also ambassador to Vienna, and several of very significant posts for France. So he was already from 1799 and into the 19th century looked upon as a potential adversary to Napoleon Bonaparte when he came to his top post after 1799.
He's kind of good buddies with Napoleon, isn't he?
Yeah, he was initially, but he was also a man who was looked upon as more like kind of a desktop general, which is not entirely right, but it has something to do with it afterwards. But he became one of the 16 marshals that Napoleon appointed as emperor in 1804. So he was really among the camarilla of generals.
The inner circle.
In the circle, indeed, yeah. So, but this man is he during the 1805, 1810, 1805, 1807, 8 campaigns in Europe, he more or less got into a enemy relation to internal enemy relation to Napoleon. So he more or less wanted to have an exit strategy, and and in 1810 that exit strategy was fulfilled with the proposition from representatives of Sweden asking him in to stand as a crown prince for Sweden, and then also a head of the government, because they were looking for a field marshal with experience, victorious experience, and that was one of the requisites, like the qualification markers to become the head of government in Sweden. Yeah. So then he enters, and he accepts this, and he becomes then head of government from the summer autumn of 1810. And
the way I understood this is that Sweden hopes that with him being such a great general, that they hope to regain Finland, but that's not his intention, is it?
No, he has a more modern approach, you might say. As you mentioned, Russia here, there was Sweden was fighting on two fronts in 1808, not only against Norway and Denmark, but also against Russia, and then in the end they lost Finland, the old Duchy of Finland, to Russia, which
of course gained independence in 1917 after the Russian Revolution.
Really, right. But then this was really a trauma for the elites of Sweden, because many of the officers in the army of Sweden was also landowners in Finland. So it was also felt dearly and costly for many of them. So they were approaching him for a more revanchist policy to take back Finland. But coming from the outside and looking things in a more modern approach, he valued the situation like, oh, let's not go that way, because that will then Finland and all of Scandinavia might be a very destabilized zone of Europe forever. He thought. So let's, in opposition to that, let's rather go to a kind of agreement with Russia. And he did so. He went to Tsar Alexander and he got this deal, the Treaty of Åbo, and more or less created a new stabilized period between Sweden and Russia for the first time. Not everyone in Stockholm was happy with that. The old Gustavianer circus among the old kings, they weren't happy with it, and also many of the officers were not happy with it. But they stood by him, and the first initial alliances was with Russia, of course, but also then later on in 1812 and 13 with Hungary, and now with Austria-Hungary, with Prussia, and also with England at the end in 1813. And that, of course, changed the whole theater of Europe regarding the northern part, at least, as Denmark, Norway still kept their alliance with Napoleon. And as we know, after 1812, the disastrous move against Moscow, and then in the end, you might say that the Völkerschlacht in Leipzig, the big battle in Leipzig, where hundreds of thousands of people died, was the inevitable loss of Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. So then it was looking really bad for Frederick and Denmark, Norway, as the more or less sole ally they had. That
maybe joining Napoleon wasn't such a good idea after all.
No, not. But, well, you might say, and it's more rational thinking that saying, okay, in 1807, that could have been a smart idea, because Frederick was also very afraid of Napoleon occupying Jutland, for instance. So that was another part of it. So
yeah, I mean, it did just dispose
in the long run, of course. Yeah, in the long run,
it dispose the whole Roman Empire the year before, so it was really close to Denmark at that point.
Indeed, yeah, it was. But that's now we have talked long about the pre-history, but now it's time to introduce the Treaty of Kiel of 14th of January, which is the masterpiece of Karl Johan, as Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte now is called, as Crown Prince of Sweden, and which says in Article 4 that Norway shall be ceded from the King of Denmark to the King of Sweden. So that is what everyone thought, or at least in Stockholm and Copenhagen and London and Berlin and everywhere else, that this should be the solution for the northern theater of Europe, or theater Europe of the Napoleonic Wars, at least. But someone in Norway wasn't agreeing with that, of course. So that starts, of course, the whole.
I mean, no country. To be fair, no country liked being occupied by another country. So we
can
see where they come from.
And indeed, not Sweden, who had been the main enemy, the nemesis of Norwegian armed forces for several centuries. So it was well, and this you might say
it was a hard blow to Norway.
A very hard blow, and you can say all of the memoirs and diaries written in January after the treaty was settled, that they say that what is the king doing? He's giving us away like a herd of cattle. That's a phrase that many use. And they say it is politicizing everywhere now in Norway. They're writing constitution drafts everywhere, and this is already in the 16th of January that this is spoken. So it says that this Treaty of Kiel and the information about it really spurred something that was laying latent in Norwegian society, that not everyone was satisfied with how Copenhagen ruled Norway, to say it that way.
So when do we get the idea that maybe we should have our own constitution? We want more freedom to the people. We want something of our own.
Well, there is talks already from January actually about this, and you also have talks about this in 1813. Like I've mentioned, Count Wedel Jarlsberg, who has from 1807 been a real instigator for a Swedish some kind of settlements with Sweden, and he started sketching out drafting a constitution already in October 1813 for a proposed Norwegian constitution within the union with Sweden. And this is a much more aristocratic version of a constitution than the very iceful one from May 1814. But still, there were talks about it. There was several political processes going on, and after 14th of January, it really gets on with several in Bergen, in Trondheim, everywhere in Norway, you might say, but of course, mostly in those circles where there are some kind of academics, some kind of lawyers who have the competence, the knowledge of constitution making, and has some knowledge of how this has been everywhere in Norway, everywhere in the world. So already from that point, and we have to introduce a very significant individual now. Is of course the hereditary Prince of Denmark, Christian Frederick, who is now at this time Stadtholder of Norway, kind of viceroy.
And it does kind of go on a propaganda tour, and it seemed to be well liked by the Norwegian
Very much
people.
so, yeah. He did not have this. Did not have the curriculum vitae as Karl Johan, for instance. He didn't have any kind of serious participation in war or not a great academic background. So he hadn't much on the paper, but he had charm. He had some kind of charisma, and his one of the main tasks he was sent with from Copenhagen was to revitalize the links between Norway and the monarchy of Denmark, the King of Denmark. So and this he did, and this he did with some success, because he really got fans, you might say, around Norway. Of course, among the elites. Among both.
So he was kind of like Justin Bieber of its time.
Well, yeah, he was a charming, he was a good-looking guy as well. So it's not like just Justin Bieber. He got more brains than Justin Bieber, but he had a, well, this is 200 years ago. It's a more religious society. It's a more you might say differential society. Well, looking up on authorities with more awe than we do. But so when a prince of the blood like Christian Frederick enters a town, it's of course everyone is very, wow, he's coming here. It's a kind of a fan base like the situation, but it's more well, as you know, the Danish monarchy is constituted by will of God, of course. So it's also a link to religion as well. So it's not like any pop star coming. It's a man even closely sent from God. So that's also building up to the notion of some great authority entering the city. But of course, so all civil servants, priests, even merchants, and also farmers of some significance, really, or fishermen or whatever in towns as well. They really had trying, and he was charming them, and he was giving them some notion of hope to regain their position and regain the situation for Norway after this tumultuous years from 1807 to 1814. So all the way from 1813 to early 14, he was on this Norwegian tour.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me how well liked he was, considering the disastrous war that Denmark and Norway just got itself into, that he was part of the Danish crown. It's quite fascinating how popular still he was, even though the war wasn't disaster.
And also considering the lack of, well, his superior, King Frederick from 1808, he was not a very charismatic character. He was a short guy, not very eager to talk to people at all, and he was not a very handsome guy either. So they had challenges with selling in the king as the sole sovereign of Norway as well. So I think Christian Frederick was doing a great job on behalf of the Danish monarchy, at least on that. But also for and that's even, I'm not the greatest admirer of Christian Frederick myself. I must say that the work he's doing in this winter months is great, and also influences the Norwegian constitution to become more radical than it could have been, more like the Count Wedel Jarlsberg version from 1813. But of course, when he enters this process, and we have to introduce the notables meeting, the the meeting of 16th of February 1814, where 22 of the most significant men of Eastern Norway, at least, met at Eidsvollverk, the same venue that should become the venue for the Constitutional Convention later. Settled and was well, initially they were told to give some kind of support to Christian Fredrik's claim for the Norwegian throne, because the Danish king had when he has sent sent the throne to Sweden, he can't. It was his role, Christian Fredrik's role as hereditary prince, to take that kingdom on his behalf, on his old hereditary sovereign rights, you might say.
What were they doing in the meeting of February that you mentioned in 1814? What's the reason for meeting at
well, that was to gain the support for Christian Fredrik's revolt against the Treaty of Kiel, actually. That was the initial thing. But during this meeting, he was convinced to do something else, and that was to call for a constitutional convention to get support from the people, because his initial idea was not to gain the support from the people, just from these 22 men in that room. It's been debated who was the most influential guy at this meeting, but I still reckon Professor Georg Sverdrup as one of them, originally from Orkdal in Trøndelag, but professor in Latin and Greek at the very newborn University of Oslo, or the Kongelige Fredriks Universitet. And he said that, okay, we hear that you want to take this by your hereditary right, but that's not the most modern idea. And it's even some rights that's above this idea, and that's the people's right to take part in that. Because, and that was according to general judicial law at the time, that when the king and the people, when their alliance was split, and it was not only up to the king to decide, but he also had to confront the people and look and ask them, what do you mean? So this constitutional convention was also meant to do that second part, to ask the people what they would like with the future of Norway. So that's and on behalf of that, he says quite controversially and quite opposing to Christian Fredrik that, well, considering who would be king of Norway, I could say that I could be king as well, or anyone, because you have to decide first and then ask the people's representatives to what they mean. And then you can say that, okay, if they say Christian Fredrik, then okay, then it's you who are the king. But you have to ask them beforehand. And that leads on to the process with the Constitutional Convention, with calling out for elections all over Norway from after the 16th of February. And also that Christian Fredrik, he should rule as a regent, not as king, but regent, until the convention was gathered. So this, and that sets out a totally new process in Norway, of course, with elections all over, even in northern Norway, although when elected in Finnmark, for instance, on the top tip of Norway, they reached Trondheim in July 1814, and I'm told that story, it's all over. So it's the information and the how things.
We didn't have internet back then. Maybe hard to believe.
Not telephone, not even telex or fax machines. so yes, they had problems with the information, but at least all from northern Trøndelag and south were represented at this.
We had a chance.
Yeah, indeed. So everyone gathered then at the 10th of April. This was, of course, a process with very democratic at the time, you might say. It's because even the
was Norway more modern in that sense?
It was, yes, it was. I think it was influenced by French elections in the 1790s on that part. Although we might say that it's more influenced by German. I'm not sure. I don't think there have been looked really into what was the election rules, what was the prime examples there. But still, what was said was that it's not from, of course, the biggest towns. The biggest town was Bergen. They had 4 representatives. Trondheim and Christiania had 2 each, and also Kristiansand. But all the land diocese now a phrase was left from my head, valgforsamling, which is of course
yeah.
you're running from that
Yeah.
area. It's a phrase I use every day, but I forgot it now. But from the area you're chosen from, there was always to be elected one representative from the peasantry, and that was very modern and looked upon as very democratic.
So it wasn't just the elite that was drawn.
It was not only the bishops, generals, or merchant house leaders. No, it was also peasants. You might say it wasn't the cotters or the lenders or anything. It was of course the farmers with land who were chosen.
But of course, I imagine that the elite had most say in this case.
Indeed. Yes, and when they come to Eidsvoll for the Constitutional Convention, there is of course an asymmetry between representatives of how educated they are, how trained they are in political processes, and of course a peasant from Setesdal is not as well trained as a judge like Falsen, who has been so Christian Magnus Falsen, also the man known as the father of the Constitution. Because of his many different roles and his wide knowledges about constitutions all over the world. So there was a wide range of competence in the convention. But there was also critical voices from Sweden on the election form, because the different military departments were also looked as voting areas, or we have to find this phrase, but still. So the land armies, the lower officers, the top officers, they had their own representatives in the convention. And Swedes, I think it's Per Adam Wallmark, who was an editor in Stockholm. He said that this is just like a sultan's core of janissaries, meaning that every military representative would support Christian Frederick because he was the high commander. So Sweden looked upon that as a very undemocratic part because of the potentiality of these representatives to follow their top man, which was Christian Frederick.
Yeah. Now,
something
I wanted to take about. Sorry, that's a little bit background noise here. I apologize for this, but there's something I found a little bit fascinating was the Bergen representative. I forget the name, but the journey from Bergen to Eidsvoll it wasn't quite easy. It was probably, we didn't have the railway then. It had still a couple of years to come the Bergen Oslo railway line. So how did the journey go from Bergen to Eidsvoll?
That was so troublesome. For most, it was by wagon or by horse. But for many along the coast, of course, it was use of boat. And the representatives of Bergen, they went up through what is now called Sognefjorden, and they entered by Lærdal and up there. And why we know much about it, it's by one of the representatives, I think it's Konov, who has a diary, a travel diary from this. So he gives his complaints about the accommodation from every place, complain about the food and everything. So we get a very vivid, colorful description of how their fare was. But of course, this was looked upon as the major task, so they couldn't stay back. So they had to challenge all weather and all other conditions that Yeah. So when they entered Lærdal, the very inner parts of the Sognefjorden, and they had to go by wagon up to over the Filefjell, which was rather tumultuous as well. So they had a tough time getting to Eidsvoll, and of course they entered. Most of them entered the 9th of April. Some of them on the same day, the 10th, and some of the friends around the circles of Christian Frederick also met before that. But they come from all over Norway these days in around the 9th and 10th of April. And it was the start day, and the 10th of April was the starting day, and that was not. It was a mass, a local mass, and there was also the presentation of the election protocols from all over. So, and you actually on this day you see the features of opposition in the group of constitution delegates. because it was that like this election committee was headed by the prince himself, Christian Frederick, and he was assisted by two men, Bishop Bugge from Trondheim and also von Holten, who was the personal secretary of Christian Frederick. And every representative have to deliver their proposals from their own constituency. That was the word, constituency. Thank you.
How much role did Christian Frederick have a say in crafting the constitution? Because was it just moral support, more or less, or was it just how did he have a say?
He was presented some drafts. He was presented at least 3 or 4 or even 5, but the 5th I don't think had very much impact on him. But the most influential draft from Christian Magnus Falsen and his teacher friend Johan Gunder Adler, known as the Adler-Falsen draft. He gave comments on that and also gave comments on others. So he had his personal opinion, although he should be looked upon as a person outside the convention itself, although he was the only man living in the building when he was when the convention was taking place. But I know even when there were dinners, he had his own room where and the table was called Prinsens Tafel, which is the table of the prince, where he changed those eating with him for every meal. So it was of course a democratic notion in that everyone should meet the prince, but it was also his possibility to promote his own views to as many as possible in the convention, of course, as well. So he was taking part, yes, but not officially a member of the convention. But he also had to attend meetings as well, because he was a regent, as I said, and the government the council was situated in Oslo in Christiania, so I had to go back and forth to Christiania to attend the meetings of the government as well.
Now, the way I understood it, we don't have actually much, sadly, written evidence of what actually happened in the room while they found the constitution. Is there a reason for this? Did they want to keep it secret, or did they? Well, don't we have much written references from the actual meetings that taking place during founding the constitution? Well, there was
what was called Riksforsamlingens forhandlinger, which is a set of drafts from the. But so that's one source for what happened. But that is lacking. That has a lot of loopholes in that. But you also have many diaries from at least mostly from the first part of the constitutional convention, at least the first fortnight from the 10th to the 26th April. And some of them are very amusing. Some are very short, and some are very followed by their own perspectives. But I think it's not. I'm not entirely agreeing that you don't have sources. You have a lot of sources. You have also several
from the actual
letters.
meetings.
From the actual meetings. Well, you don't have the official meetings annuals or annals, or what you say, but you have the forhandlinger, as I mentioned. But what you don't have, and what we lack really, is something from the most influential committee, the Constitution Committee, which is where they drafted all the articles, the paragraphs in the Constitution, and also the principles of the Constitution first. That was a very tight, airtight room, you might say, and they officially didn't accept any kind of what you call it, references, yes, from that meeting at all. So, and that's I think that is the most what we lack the most, because they had a common agreement, the 15 members of this committee, to not speak too much or note this, just the.
I mean, if it came out,
session.
I mean, I understand it, because if it came out, it could be disastrous, I believe, if what they discussed.
Yeah, well, they knew from day one that there was 2 factions of this convention, and of course the large faction was informally headed by Christian Magnus Falsen, a judge coming from a Danish law family. Many of them had been professors or lawyers or judges before, many of his relatives. So he was the man in charge of the committee, as well as presenting this draft, this total law book draft, and also being this informal leader, as I said. So he was this most significant individual at the convention, and he was also heading this large contingency of people known as the Independence Party, which is of course the label that we make as historians afterwards. And the large minority was called the Union Party, because they sought to get an agreement with Sweden and also with the great powers, looking upon the lack of trade relations, which was disastrous for the Norwegian society at the moment in 1813 and 14, as their prime mover to establish that kind of a. Okay, they also wanted a constitution with sovereignty for Norway and some kind of freedom, but not as democratic or as radical as the ending product became in May 1814.
Now, this will be a little fun fact about the Constitution. As you know, in America, the second Constitution is that you get to keep your guns. But in Norway, the second Constitution is that we get to keep our pitchfork. They can't get our pitchfork away.
Well, yeah, well,
they're not going to get my pitchfork.
Well, I'm not that interested in the pitchforks, I must say, but it's true. And we actually, I didn't mention that as into the introduction, but the museum Eidsvoll 1814, as I'm a director for, we have also launched a project, which has also presented books, and it's called Founding Fathers Across the Atlantic, and is looking on the two oldest constitutions, the American and as you can see on this, we have mixed the Trumbull painting of the Declaration of Independence with Eidsvoll 1814, that's in the Stortinget, the Parliament of Norway. So we use that as our banner for the project, and we take the standpoint for this project, which is also you can see we have Falsen at the front there, and Falsen very much looked to James Madison and the 1787 Philadelphia Constitution as for his idea of how a division of power should be sketched or drafted in the Norwegian Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution is the you might say the most significant example they looked upon, but they also look upon the different French constitutions, even to the Swedish of 1809, and also the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. Batavian also, but they also look upon how they also look to autocratic constitutions for the example of how the king should be included in the constitution, because Norwegian constitution, of course, have a king, have a monarchy, which you don't have in the Philadelphia Constitution, of course. So there are Norwegian specificities that you have to include as well, which also means the allodial rights, odelsretten, which is a rather peculiar law in European and Western law history. So you didn't have only international, but you also have Norwegian and regional aspects that had to be included. And this 15-man committee, the Constitution Committee, had to be really going through all their own views on this and own drafts. And you had people like Count Wedel Jarlsberg, you have the loose cannon on deck, Nicolai Wergeland, the father of national poet Henrik Wergeland, who was part of the Union Party, but as well as shooting against the Independence Party, also shoot at his own and the Union Party. So he was an unpredictable guy. And so they had a lot of fights, I guess, in this committee. In addition to also receiving up to 30 different drafts they should copy and paste from to find the best alternatives for Norway. So they had a really difficult task, those 15 who sat in this committee.
Now, something that we were discussing was whether or not they should have a nobility or whether they should dispose of this. Why did and they, of course, chose to dispose of the nobility, which means, unfortunately, I can never become nobility myself. But why did they choose to dispose of the nobility in the first place?
Yeah, but because both, well, leaders from both factions, both Vedel and Falsen, they were sympathetic to. Firstly, they were sympathetic to a nobility. Well, Falsen, he changed his mind, but I think that was also colored by how they divided the parliament system as well. Because as one of the notions that make the Norwegian constitution radical in 1814 is that we have a one-chamber parliament. Well, we have something called the Lagting and all this thing, but everything is elected from the parliament, Stortinget. So you don't have a House of Lords or House of Commons like in Britain, or you don't have the Senate and the House of Representatives like in the US. So this one chamber parliament, or a quasi two-chamber parliament, is making the parliament or the legislative body very influential.
What was the reason for doing this? Was it
well,
was it to simplify it, or?
Well, there are different views on this, but Peter Motsfeldt from Bergen, an artillery captain who had been serving in one of the slave islands in the Caribbean, St. Thomas, but he was represented in Bergen, representing Bergen. He said that it was neither natural nor wise for Norway, who does not have an ability to have an upper a House of Lords, you might say. And that was also very coloring the idea of why should we introduce something we don't have the hereditary basis, the demographic basis for? Why establish something new that we don't see the point in establishing?
I mean, we did have dukes from the Viking Age, from 12th, 13th century, but that was like 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, so you could. There was, of course, ideas of reconstituting things like a new aristocracy, as it's I think it's called in the 10th, 11th century. But that was not. And you might say that here you can see that the democratic part, the peasant representatives, also played a role while supporting those who went against establishing this, because they didn't see any use of establishing a nobility.
Was there a fear that we could draw into serfdom if we did have a nobility?
Probably not a serfdom, but at least some kind of new competition for land and new competition for their kind of industry, which of course was agricultural. So yes, I think there was this, if not a fear, it was very large parts of skepticism, at least, for establishing a new kind of elite that they didn't see the point of, and could be of some kind of competition for them. Yeah.
So we joked earlier about the Second Amendment in America, but to be serious now, what was some of the Constitution that we were talking about, and how much from the Jarlsberg Constitution in Sweden did they choose to come into get into the Constitution of Norway?
Well, there were elements of how to restrain the king, you might say, or at least there were, like, Falsen wanted more power to the king, to the ruling body, the king and government, than Count Wedel.
So it would be more or less like Denmark, Danish.
Yes, it was like that. It was more, and the notion that also the king should be given only a postponing veto, not a total veto, was also done by Count Wedel. But there were, and also that there was the formation of government and their position in relation to the parliament was also quite different. But at least the idea of a Montesquieu kind of a division of power was more aristocratic and more Montesquieu at Count Wedel than the actual constitution that was decided. But initially, even Falsen was also a skeptic of a very radical parliament, and also he was also against a one-chamber parliament. But there were other aspects that you might say that differ, and we also have the black spot on the constitution, the paragraph abolishing Jews from Norway, which of course Count Wedel was totally against, while Falsen looked around himself and looked to the priests who were the real instigators for abolishing Jews. Was
that anti-Semitic at the time, or wasn't that turning for word?
It was a part of what we could look upon as a Protestant racism that was the ruling agenda at that time. So yes, it was racist, but it wasn't racist in contemporary views. So that's because the moral compass has changed since 1814 and now. Yeah. So, but in our view, it was well, you can say that everyone was racist in that convention. But Count Wedel, he was less racist at least. But he wasn't only looking looking towards the Jews in a philanthropic or a humanist way, but it was also economic, because he knows that the bigger banking firms in London were Jews. So he was looking, if they're going to be foreign loans, which Norway had to survive on after 1814, he had to look to London. And problem he got immediately after 1814, because he became, okay, spoiler alert, he became Minister of Finance afterwards in the new government, in the new Union of Sweden. And he one of his big obstacles was that any firm of Jewish or Mosaic descent in London said, you're not getting any loan from us with that constitution. Because of course we had this repressive article that the Jews and Jesuits and all monastic orders were not allowed in Norway.
That it's just religious freedom in Norway, which is kind of ironic to me, because they didn't want the Jews.
Indeed, it's one of the strangest things about the Constitutional Convention, because initially they think that it was a freedom of religion, as you say, but they ended with a rather repressive article on this. So it's I'm not sure if they had a bad day or what happened, but it wasn't. It very strange.
Religious freedom except the Jews and Jesuits.
Yeah. So it could have been either way, you say.
And other people we don't like.
Yeah. So well, this all the articles. Well, first it was the 11 principles for what a constitution should be like. Having the Constitution Committee was also preparing that for the plenary session in Rikssalen, in the Constitution Hall. But then after that, there was going through every article. And then concluding around the 9th or 11th May, I think it's when they're all through the paragraph, and then ending with a economic debate on the 13th of May.
I want to say that there is a famous painting that people, I don't remember where they talk about the Constitution. You see all the representatives in the room of Eidsvoll, but that argues that this is from, people think it's from 17th of May, but it argues that it is from 11th May. That this
I think maybe it's the 9th of May, because it's Falsen who is acting as president of the convention, and he is I think he's giving the the hammer over to Colonel Hegerman, who's the last. No, sorry, it's Professor Sverdrup, of course, who's the last one. So I think it's 9th of May. This may mean that it's the actual date of the painting in Stortinget, the great painting behind the speaker. Yeah, but still. So on 13th of May, it was a great debate about whether the Norwegian state had an economy to have a basis for a state, and it was the other large committee, but it wasn't as significant as the Constitutional Committee, but it was of course the Committee of Finance, and they proposed a draft saying that yes, we have enough, we have our minings, we have our lumber and timber merchant business, and we have our fish, and we have our shipping as well. So we should and we have money, some money to survive on at least. So they proposed that they proposed a draft for a national budget. But then actually this was meant to be an economy debate, but it was actually very much about patriotism. And you have one of the loveliest, most rhetorically beautiful speeches in this rather prosaic debate, because Falsten and Georg Sverdrup, they were saying that if you really want the goal of a Norwegian state, you have to do the offering, which is a barrel of grain or something that was each man should be proposing for as a capital for Norway. But then Count Wedel said that this is futile. This is a utopia, because all the trade links are gone. There are embargoes on us. There are a blockade as well, like it was in 1808. So they said it's you can't talk of a Norwegian economy which doesn't give any kind of income, and the domestic trade is not large enough to make us survive. But then there was a Bergen priest named Jonas Rein who stood on the table and had this beautiful speech about patriotism, saying something that every man will be looked upon with pity who doesn't do this offering in this day for the Norwegian state, etc., etc. Which is also which resulted in a massive majority for the drafting of a plan for a Norwegian economy, so to speak, and a national budget, which was rather naive looked upon in posterity, but still, at that time, it was the rhetorics that convinced the majority to support it. And afterwards, there was a customs officer named Omsen who said that, okay, poetry is one thing, reality is something different. So there wasn't that much belief of that decision afterwards either. But then we come more to the more what you call consolidating the more where you see more unity, and that is of course 16th of May, when they finally decides on the word chosen for the constitution and the rhetorics. So that's the Constitution Day, actually, 16th of May. And then the 17th of May is of course chosen as our national day because of the dating, because the dating in the Constitution says Eidsvollverk, 17th of May, 1814.
And of course, if you ever travel to Norway and in May, you absolutely should travel to be here on 17th May. It's quite a wild celebration.
Yeah, it is. It's wild, but it's you could say I very often get this question: isn't it even nationalistic the way you celebrate a national day? And I say I think it's a very important distinction between that kind of sound patriotism, that it's the children parade which is the most important thing, and the flag and the parades. It's not tanks and missile rockets like you see in other countries. So if we had that the Karl Johan Street in the middle of Norway was filled with tanks and missile rockets, that's would have been a different dinner, I think.
And especially during the Nazi occupation after this, we really wanted to celebrate a national holiday after the Nazi occupation
and finished. This view from April 1940 with German soldiers going through in the same venue that the children's parade were going and are going afterwards. That's also, of course, a very symbolic contrast to what we do today. So I think it's a great happening, as you say, and it's I must say it's mostly it's
and of course a lot of ice cream.
Yeah, that's you have to go to Eidsvoll to see the real thing, of course, to experience Constitution Hall in. But if we go back to history, the 17th of May was, of course, the royal election. That was it's more a royal day when you look about on history than a Constitution Day, because the Constitution was decided for already on the 16th. But you also see the division of the convention on this royal election, because the first to give his vote was Peder Anker. He was the second oldest man. He was the highest ranking man. He was Grand Cross of Dannebrog, which was he was even ranked higher than his son-in-law, who was Count Wedel. So, and he said that at the and the president said that after the negotiations, it came to that they had to have an oral representation of what they said, that they had to speak out what they meant. And Peder Anker was the first elector, so he said that okay, at the time, and I think it's wisest to talk to Sweden and the great powers before we go to an election of a king. That's what he says.
And of course,
the majority says that they started like the parliament in London and booing and saying, "Woo, you have to rule, you have to say a name." And even the president, where Professor Sverdrup at the time, a very authoritative man, he said that no, you have to. It's our obligation to choose a name. We have to change.
And then, of course, Christian Frederick comes in and he says, why don't
I
become the King of Norway?
So he said that, he said that, well, then, of course, I of course, choose Prince Christian Frederick as King of Norway. And then number 2 elector is Christian Magnus Falsen, because they both come from Akershus Amt, this is alphabetically ordered. So and he says that I choose immediately Christian Frederick as King of Norway. And this is a division. Of course it's an anonymous choice of Christian Frederick. The vote declaration is different. Like those who are, because after these two have given their vote, they say either I choose like Chamberlain Anker, because he was a Danish Chamberlain as well, or I choose as Judge Falsen, Sorenskriver Falsen.
Now, of course, this is a big breach of the Kiel Treaty, because, of course, they were promised to Sweden as a prize for choosing the right side on the Napoleonic Wars. And one character we left out for quite a while, which we thought is rather significant in the story, is Karl Johan or Charles XIII, as he may be known. He's not very happy with this.
No, of course not. And he's still dealing with Napoleon on the continent when it starts in the winter months. So, but soon after the decisions made at Eidsvoll with the constitution and the election of Christian Frederick as King of Norway, he is on his way back to Sweden with his veteran troops who have fought against Napoleon and won. And they, when they are finding out that this is going to be a troublesome negotiation, they think that they prepare for war, and they have a more effective intelligence than Norwegian authorities have, so they more or less know what happens in Norway quite broadly. But then
they do have Swedish representatives in the
well, yes, you have Swedish spies in Norway. That's documented. You have also even have English spies in Norway at that time.
Now, something we haven't talked about, which I kind of understand, is that they were talked about being an English colony as well, briefly. And
very briefly.
I thank God that didn't happen, because they obviously had no idea how England treated their colonies.
No, but there were many of the merchants who had very close relations to authorities in England, actually. So there were negotiations. Well, there were more or less informal talks about this. But what happened after the Christian Frederick, also his electors, the election of him was known in Europe all around. Then England was first on the field to send out a special emissary, John Morier, to gain more information about what happened in Norway. So he sent quite immediately, first to Kristiansand and then up to Christiania, and he has his connections with the Union Party, because Peder Anker, who had been helping out many members of many Tory MPs actually, when they were taken as prisoners of war during 1807, 1808, during the war between England and Denmark, Norway. So he had actually, he got more information about what London meant than Christian Frederick got, because he didn't have the same relation. But when confronted with this special emissary from England, Christian Frederick was also known that, well, I've had several talks already with Count Wedel and Peder Anker. So Christian Frederick was rather pissed actually when he was informed that someone knew more than him about the situation. And then
I think we can all say that we are very happy indeed that we did not become an English colony.
Yeah, well, that's what really came as the solution was much better indeed, because after this special emissary, there are the official delegates from the great powers. You have Augustus Foster from England. You have a Prussian, a Russian, and an Austrian who comes to trying to convince Christian Frederick to abdicate, because that is not according to the Treaty of Kiel, which they all have supported. And now this rightly, Christian Frederick answers that that's not up to me. I have not elected myself. You have to confront the conventional group who have elected me. I can't answer for them. And so he used that as a more constitutionally buffer against any kind of attacks from these delegates, because it says that's not up to me. I haven't elected. I can't abdicate from something I haven't elected myself.
Now,
so he's using
as we have seen from the earlier with the Treaty of Russia, that Karl Johan and Charles XIII again, he is a rather diplomatic king. He doesn't really want war there, as there's building up the war with Sweden at this time, because they fear that Sweden might intervene, which they initially spoiler alert does, and we will talk about in a second. But he hoped for a diplomatic solution, and he's quite modern in that sense.
Yeah, but he is very convinced that Christian Frederick must abdicate. That's a point one criteria for everyone, I think. But well, then these delegates, their suggestions goes to barren ground. You might say it doesn't pull through. So they leave they leave Norway, and then it's war. And then of course Charles John Karl Johan is back with his veteran troops, and they attack Norway, and it's a rather swift operation.
It's a disaster for Norway.
Indeed, yes. At least from Østfold area, from the southern part, it's very problematic. They do some more resistance in the Hedmark Kongsvinger area, but it's only some days more than a fortnight, then it's all over. And it's because the fortress of Fredrikstad, they fall very swiftly, and Hvaler falls and everything. So it's a very problematic development of war in the South theater.
Now, contrary to what you may think, the population and the peasants are actually happy to see Swedish troops, because they bring food and bread back to the population. So instead of like the last time when Charles XII invaded, they were against him, but this time they are rather pro-British, Swedish troops invading.
And many of them are that, because they have lifelong experience with good trade relations with the Swedes. So not considering the geopolitical situation between the governments. So they have been smuggling all over the borders anyway. So they, when they see Swedes, they don't mind that much about it. So that's but after that. The war situation is more or less settled, and they go to the negotiating table.
Something I do want to bring up is that there seemed to me that they were such a good, actually, because they were placed on the border, the Norwegian, which I find amusing, is that they were so good friends that they already knew each other. They had drinking parties together, ate together, and when during fighting, when it was breaking up, that they became friends and ate together, even during the wartime. That they agreed to shoot up instead of at each other. No, I don't know if they actually did this, but it's something I find amusing about the Scandinavian. It shows the Scandinavian spirit, that it's kind of amusing.
I think very much changed in those 7 years, because the war situation in 1808 was more fierce than in 1814, and they had to develop new trade relations during this blockade situation, because they couldn't use the sea, because the British Navy and all the privateers in the sea areas hindered that kind of transport. So they have to make informal relations with Swedes to manage to get some of commodities from all over. But just to lead on with the after the war, because then Karl Johan, Charles John, he looks as if a winner, but he goes into the negotiations with the Norwegians, or with Karl Johan, with Christian Frederick, I mean, and he looks upon that with it's the end result, the convention of Moss, as it's called, Mosse-konvensjonen.
That is, of course,
what? Sorry?
It's the most Ironmark where it takes place.
Yeah,
right?
that's also owned by the Anker family, by the way. It's a that is okay. It's of course a sanction of Norwegian loss, and the abdication of Christian Frederick is one of the prerequisites. Well, one of the claims there, of course. But you also have a civil victory for Norway, and that is that Karl Johan is accepting the constitution of Eidsvoll 17th of May.
Now it does try to oppress the constitution, and it always does after he takes over Sweden as well.
But it's of course when they're negotiating, it's everything is on the table and off the table. But in the end, he accepts the constitution as the leading document for Norway's future, which is a civil victory for Norway, although it's a military loss. But that, of course, many people looked upon well, they question why he did that, because it's in the long run, and he did also change that view later, after at least at 1821, when he really is pissed with the Norwegian Parliament and Norwegian government because not giving support for his claims.
I mean, it has been argued that he wants friendly relation, because if Norway is friendly with Sweden, they want the rebellions in.
He doesn't use that notion of friendship. He says that for instance, like it's also a question, why did he not take Iceland, Greenland, and Faroe Islands? And that's because I think he was a land officer. He was not a naval officer, and he was looking to England and saying, well, the British, they dominate, so let's forget those parts of the Norwegian kingdom. Let's just take Norway proper. But in the same manner, he didn't want any kind of long-lasting military activities in Norway. He didn't want a Spanish guerrilla war, for instance.
He didn't want Swedish troops in Norway, like in Fredrikstad, Fredrikstad, for example.
Yeah. So and of course, hilly Norway, it could be problematic in many of the dalfører, as we say, many of the valleys in Norway. So that was also in his view, and they also say, of course, that he had some pressure from Europe, because he was also taking part of the Congress of Vienna at the time, which was really setting the future for Europe after Napoleon, and going there with a war in your handbag, so to speak, would be problematic as a negotiator in the European negotiations there. So it was very important for him to fast settle the situation in Norway.
Was he a very modern, like we discussed before, was a very modern king in that sense?
Yes, he didn't. He's modern in one sense. He's very military and more archaic in a military sense. But when it comes to setting civil things, he's not taking into consideration all traditions and every other aspect that has colored Scandinavia for centuries. He goes right into, looks on the map and says, this is the best solution, and this system will function best for Norway as well. So I think he has a modern approach, but he's also pressured by time and also by other neighbors like the Russians and everything.
Now, something that I kind of forgot to ask when we talked about his origin is, would it be fair to compare him, call him Europe's Hamilton in a way? He jumped from nothing and he ends up being king in Sweden and king of Sweden, Norway at the end. Would it be fair to kind of compare him to Hamilton?
You mean Charles John or Karl Johan?
Yeah.
No, well, no, I'm not sure that we have in our project. I challenge several historians to find a Norwegian constitution, father of constitution, and an American founding father, and actually the one who was paired with Hamilton was Count Wedley Artsberg, which of course is when their birth is quite opposite, of course, but they have the same thoughts of a federal government, of a strong federal government, and also of a national banking system, actually. So they have exact the same ways of setting a bank plan into real life, so to speak, in Norway and US. So that I've used that as better. But just so it's now who's the Hamilton in a broader perspective? I'm not sure, because Hamilton, of course, is a unpopular guy and looked upon with disgust from Jefferson and Madison and
I mean, he did get a musical though, so he must.
Yeah, indeed. So I did actually present. Well, I gave a historical presentation for when the Hamilton the musical was presented at Colosseum in Oslo, and I said that if Norway, you can't get a Steve Jensen the musical or Jan Tore Sanner the musical, it wouldn't be right. But you should rather
imagine a rap
but
musical
I said
about
that
Arne Solberg.
Yes, but you still you should have rather used Count Vedli Arsberg, the black metal opera, for using a more kind of a music genre that's more related to Norway. so that's it. No, I wouldn't agree on the Karl Johan and Hamilton. I'm afraid, although they are Parvenese, both of them, coming from humble birth, but rising to the top of the society. Of course, they are.
Now, before we go, what are some of the constitutions that were agreed upon, and how anything changed? Of course, it must have since in modern times.
Yes, much changed, but much of everyday life lasted, you might say. Of course,
I imagine the Jew part of the Jewish constitution
that was amended during the 1840s. I think 1851 is the year when the Norwegian Parliament finally put an end to it. But from everyday life, you had elections. You know, well, the year of 1814, as I see it, it's a political revolution for Norway, going from an autocratic state with no political taking part from Norwegian citizens to this year with two elections, both in the winter and also in the autumn. You have two constitutional conventions. You have war. You have international, and I didn't mention Karsten Anker in this as well. So who is fighting for Norway in London and getting in every London paper, getting Norway.
Is he the guy that is get arrested, or is that another guy?
Sorry, yeah, he's also arrested, yes, because he has some his creditors are after him because of some lack of payments as well. so he has a troublesome stay in London, but he is also doing a very good job in March and April, convincing the large minority, the Whigs and they were of course headed by the famous Earl Grey, the man with a T, and he was actually chief whip of the Whig party, and they supported him, but he didn't convince the Tories, the leading majority of both chambers of the parliament. But he got Norway on the agenda in London papers and all over Europe actually, because of that, because so many papers looked to London. So Norway was on the agenda as a national entity for the first time, and then so election and taking part in that is of course once they didn't do that every year, but that was also part of it. And then you had the local judges, the local state system that survived, so that was much the same. But until at least 1836, when you get the so-called formannskapsloven, which is laws on regional and local administration, where you get a the start of local democracies in Norway. So that's the second most important, until you even get parliamentarism then in the 1880s, and in the end then 1905 full sovereignty also in affairs of foreign and military politics. So yeah.
Now, before you go, of course, I always let the historian promote the work, and if they have anything about to share, and of course, the answer is kind of obvious. But why should people, if they do travel to Norway, it's just 1 hour away from Oslo, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. But why shouldn't people take the time to visit Eidsvoll if they come to Norway?
Well, it's a rather remarkable piece of politics done in the total periphery of Europe at the time. It's a very undernourished politically. Norway are able to create a very modern constitution. That is that is the only thing that you can defend the notion of a miracle year, I think. but you have even in a politically undernourished part of Europe, individuals that are reading, that are communicating by letter to others, and you see so many of the international traits of current ideas of how a constitution should be, how it should look like. So they are intelligent people, even in Norway, that could get this through. And it's a fascinating story of how
Indeed,
with everything from being getting an international you might say a United Nations observatory corps 150 years before the United Nations were designed. But you have this international view on this, and you have a very radical, maybe the world's most radical constitution at the time. It's much more radical than the more aristocratic American one, and all the very revolutionary constitutions of France have fallen, of course, with the introduction of Napoleon and his Code Napoleon, which is much more authoritarian and
because it's always the French.
It's but the French had their it's also there's good and bad things in France always. So the lessons for Norway is that you have to have some smart individuals, but you also have to have luck, and I think we had a lot of luck in this. It's very easy for Charles John to have made his decisions otherwise than he really did, and he really could have put much more forces in Norway and demanded a new constitution written by him and his adjutants.
I do have a tremendous amount of respect for Charles the 13th.
Yeah, me too.
To go the route that he did and choose an open, modern, and political way.
Me too. I admire his his guts and his ideas, but mainly from that period, from 1810 to 1814. Later in his period, he became a more repressive king, and a really old old man also in his thoughts, I think. So it didn't develop well. But in those crucial years from 1810 to 1814, is a very modern individual, very modern politicians, and taking bold decisions that also was very much for the good of Norway as well. So I think that's I know it's not very popular all over. In Denmark, it's not very popular, but even among scholars in Denmark. So there's different views. Even in France, it's a very controversial. He's looked upon as a traitor towards Napoleon in some circles. Along the Napoleonic Society, for instance, there is very controversial views on Bernadotte.
No, there's something we didn't discuss as well, because obviously Norway became a part of Sweden, Norway. But what happened to Prince Frederick?
He was, of course, as king, head of government in those few weeks in the summer. So,
I was king for a few weeks of Norway.
Yes, but then after the Moss Convention in August, he more takes the position as a lame duck, and there are more of a provisional committee or provisional government that rules on his behalf. So in the last days in October, he's just waiting to get his boat back, and then that's a side story. But one of those who is receiving him at Bygdøy, where out in Oslo, where he's sent from, is actually one of the constitution drafters, sending one of the most radical drafts. And his name is Count Holsteinborg. He's a young nobleman from Zealand, from Denmark, and he puts so much effort in that Christian Frederick is the new man, but he's getting very disappointed after 1814 because even as a king, he in the 1840s, Christian Frederick is not a promoter of democratic thoughts like he was in 1814. So he goes back to Danish autocracy.
He does become a king of, sorry about background noise there, but he does become king of Denmark eventually, doesn't he?
Yes, in 1840 he does, after Frederick has died. But even in those 8 years of rule, he doesn't. It's only in the last 2 years of his rule that he is, and that is of course in the revolutionary year of 1848. So it's very there are external factors as well there for why he is going into discussions of a constitution for Denmark, which is becoming more radical than the Norwegian in 1814. But hey, there's 34 years it has gone as well. So he's not fulfilling the dream from 1814 in his politics afterwards, I would say, which is a disappointment, you might say. But this actually just the side story there with Holsteinberg, because I've looked into his works, and he was also a very reformer in Denmark, but he didn't have the networks, he didn't have the political support for it. So that is actually one of my disappointment. I'm not disappointed with Christian Frederick, because he did as much as he could, but I'm more disappointed with politicians around King Frederick in Denmark and Copenhagen, because they had the opportunity really, because King Frederick was really in a fragile state as king during 1814, and if there was a political party in Denmark who would promote reforms, that was the time, but they didn't, and that's historically I find that rather disappointing by a rather academically and enlightened elite who doesn't use that initiative, that momentum to also change Denmark as the Swedes had done from 1809 and as the Norwegians did in 1814. So that's I'm ending on Danish Danish critiques here. Sorry.
Now, before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? Any social media where people can find you if they have more questions about 1814 and the year of how we got our constitution?
Yes, well, you said, well, I self-promoting isn't the best thing to do, but Spille om Norge, that's my book on 1814, and I showed the Hedegart biography. But we have a, as I said, a project that isolates 1814, looking on the Norwegian and the American Constitution and the shared experiences and also the shared ideals in the constitutions, and we use that as a standing point for how it's become very different societies, the American and the Norwegian. So we're producing 2 more books. We have one book which is finished. It was about Norwegian American cooperation since 1814 to now, and we're going to produce another book who is looking on national monuments and the role they play and the stories they tell. So that's a American, British, Argentinian, Norwegian cooperation, actually.
Very much looking forward to that one. Thank you so much. Before we go, I forgot to say this last week, but recently, a few weeks ago, we reached 100 subscribers on YouTube, which is the first of many milestones. So thank you to everyone who was with us from the start. As we said, we are available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you got the time, write a little review if you like this episode on Apple Podcasts. It would help us out a lot. This has been Well That Is Well. My name is Erlend, and I'll see you next time.